Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our September heat wave analysis for the summer readiness. My name is Brenda Corona, here from the Stakeholder Affairs Group representing the California ISO. Today, I'll be helping facilitate this call. Along, I will be joined by Guillermo Bautista Aderarte, who is our Director, Market Analysis and Forecasting at the California ISO. So let's get started with a few meeting reminders for this call. This call will be recorded for informational and inconvenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you do experience any technical issues during the call, please send a chat to my event producer, Marvin, or myself, and we will help you. These are the few instructions for today's call. If you're connected through audio, you're on your computer, please use the Call Me option select above the raise hand icon above your chat window. As well, for those who are audio only, please press #2 if you're dialed in. And remember, please state your name and affiliation before making a comment. As well, please provide your name and affiliation during the comment that you submit through chat. And also, just a reminder, you're able to submit chat to all panelists. And thank you, Marvin. He also provided instructions to submit through our panelist group. And we will get started with our introduction with Guillermo. And I can see you, Guillermo, and let's test quick audio with you.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Guillermo. Thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion and go over the analysis that we have implemented for the summer conditions, specifically for the heat wave period of early September. Okay, so as you may have seen, we have posted the report a couple of weeks ago. The material is quite extensive, and there are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of dynamics, interplays happening in the market, and obviously it's quite extensive set of material. The intent of this call is to go over the main components, the main factors that play a role during the heat wave period of early September. And there are many more details that you can entertain by yourself through the report. A couple of items before we go into the specific material. The first one, this is part of the regular effort that we have implemented for the summer readiness. We have been consistently providing these analytics on a monthly basis, and we are doing that for every month of the summer, and September happens to be the last month of the summer 2022. In addition to the standard framework that we have for these monthly reports, and given the specific condition that we dealt with in September, we expanded the scope of that standard framework of the report to be more specific about the conditions of the September 5th through 8th. That was the most critical period of the heat wave. And the material is posted publicly. We have done that in the previous month, the previous year, and that will continue to be for the future. The report has been posted since 2 weeks ago. I hope you have an opportunity to review the material. And obviously, in a matter of 2 hours, it's not possible to go through every single detail. I hope this doesn't become a memory test, because there are so many moving pieces and so many components that I will not be able to answer every single question given all the information that is out there. But I may have to refer to you to the report. And with that in mind, can we really move into the discussion? And there are 3 areas that I would like to discuss in the presentation. The first one is obviously the heat wave on its own and its impact, how that plays into the system. And much of that has to do with how the market operated. We run the system through the market, and obviously the efficacy of the market operation is quite important in this context. Along the line of the investigation, we have identified some areas for improvement. We have identified specific software issues, process issues that we have to deal with during this event. And this poses opportunities for us to improve the operation of the market. And along the line of the discussion, I will be able to describe those. I know that my dog may be a little bit distracting, so let me put it out of the picture. And let's start with the discussion. So can we move to the next slide, please? If we want to really summarize how things play out, as you know, we were dealing with this very extreme condition. At the end of the day, what really matters is that the CAISO was able to maintain reliability in the system, be able to operate with no rotating outage needs, and we have a series of factors that contributed to that outcome. And it's not just one single component, but a variety of conditions, some of those under our control, some of those more exogenous that still make a difference in the operation of the system for this critical day. The first one has to do with the capacity that we have. We have this resource adequacy capacity that makes a difference because in comparison to 2020, for instance, we have additional capacity and supply available in the system. Just to put the typical reference that we have indicated in the report, in a comparison of the 2020 versus the summer 2022, we have more than 3,000 megawatts of additional storage capacity that was still available in this critical period. And obviously, having more array capacity is always a good thing. Granted, as you will see through the report and through the discussion, we also have to rely on capacity that is above array or non-array capacity. Part of the lessons learned that we also have through the root cause analysis that we implemented in 2020 has to do with all the awareness, the coordination, the heads up that we have to do in preparation for this type of events. We took at heart this improvement in terms of the coordination and communication, and we built up all this process regarding the coordination. We start to see the conditions to come as early as 7-8 days in advance, and that was the trigger to start doing all this preparation, all this coordination, creating the awareness that we were seeing this heat wave coming into our system. And that played dividends in this case. The other component is that based also in the lessons learned from the 2020, we have implemented in the last 2 years a series of enhancements to the market operation. And those goes in the different markets and in the different areas for the sake of being better prepared, have more intelligent logic to identify these conditions and to have a better outcome given these extreme conditions. This also were a factor on how they interacted, how they resulted in a specific market results. And there was also this other component, not only on the supply side, but also on the demand side of these new state programs that provided additional relief under these critical periods. And last but not least, we also have all these demand side components. We have the deployment of the reliability demand response in addition to the economical demand response. We saw the conservation paying off with the calls for conservation that we have, including the emergency call. And the last piece that is not really under our control, but is a factor to consider, is the fact that even though we have this extreme heat wave in the system, we have to recognize that it was not as extreme across the whole West. And the implication of this is that effectively that creates some room for potential additional supply coming into our system through the imports. Had we have this extreme event across the entire West, potentially we may have relied on less imports coming into our system. So that also was a factor to consider. Next slide, please. Now, as you may have read through the report, there is a series of factors and conditions that play also a role in unintended outcome into the markets. And that eventually resulted in some unintended logic into the operation of the system. And this has to do mainly with software issues, either in the market application or somewhere else. And I will describe through the presentation these items, but just to give you the bigger picture of these conditions. The first one has to do with a series of miscounting for the capacity in the resource efficiency evaluation. That has to do with specifically the capacity test. And that is exactly the one that we put a lot of attention given all the enhancements and discussions we have had in the last two rounds of the policy initiatives. To some extent, these issues impacted the capacity test in either direction. In some cases, some of the issues resulted in overcounting capacity. In other issues, those resulted in undercounting. And once you do the balance, we can see counterfactually what would have been the outcome if we didn't have these miscalculations in the capacity test. We also have a series of effects due to software logic that we have in the market. And this goes back and touches on the scheduling priorities for interties. And it has bleeding effect because it also transpired into the capacity test. The main issue here is that even though we have very well defined the scheduling priorities for the intertie transactions, such as exports, given the current logic that we have for the scheduling priorities, there is a conflict when we overlap that with another logic of the market that is resulting in potentially unwinding the projected reductions of exports into the system. And this resulted effectively in clearing some low priority exports that shouldn't have been cleared. This also resulted in reducing some high priority and ETC TORs that shouldn't have been reduced. And the balance could be a washout, but effectively some of those materialized, some of those were reinstated after the fact, so there was no material effect. But this is still a unintended logic that we have to address, and we have addressed those through enhancements in our systems. The last big component has to do with the treatment of storage resources. There was specifically one issue that prevented storage resources to charge early in the day when the bids were above $150. And that issue was addressed. There is also some logic that didn't work properly in the calculation of the capacity test, because any capacity that was allocated for ancillary services was not properly discounted in the assessment of the capacity in the resource efficiency evaluation. And that effectively meant that the capacity test was overcounting the capacity associated with the ancillary services for storage resources. And as we go through the presentation, I will potentially go deeper into these specific components. Okay. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, now when we go into the specifics of the heat wave, we need to have the reference first of what type of event we were dealing with. And the reality is that this was a very extreme event. We have set a record load, a peak load of 52,061 megawatts. That has been the highest load peak that we have in the system. The previous one goes back all the way to 2006. We have similarly high loads in 2017, just above 50,000. But this is a record, and obviously that implies a lot of conditions that we have to deal with. We have to manage this level of demand. And it was extreme. And one of the complications was that it was not just an isolated condition for the peak, but it was a sustained heat wave that lasted effectively 10 days, going all the way from August 31st through September 9. And having that shattering condition for so long really put the stress on the market and the system to manage this level of loads. This representation is just a graphical reference of how extreme, how unusual this load event was. As you can see in the lower right-hand corner, you have the distribution of the load levels for the month of September 2022. All the others are reference to the previous day, to the previous month, to the previous years. And obviously the reference here is the 50,000 megawatt mark that is exceeded just in a couple of times in this period of 11 years. And also, if you look at the distribution, you can see that there are more, the density is greater for September as you go to the right-hand side tail of the distribution. And that simply means that it represents that there were more hours that were in this extreme range. It was not just the standalone peak hour, but many more hours were in that far right range. Next slide, please. When we talk about the load conditions, as we know, the load is very sensitive to the weather conditions, and this was an extreme heat wave event, and naturally that was reflected in the load. There are many different metrics, many different ways we can characterize how extreme that event was, and the report does a very good job in providing that reference of how many records were broken. There were temperature records that were 100 years old, and they were broken on this event all across California. There are many other references that you can read in the report about the extraordinary condition that we have to deal. One of those is that if you look at in the last 28 years, this event happens to be 1 in 25. And obviously it's relative to what period you are looking into, but all these metrics just give you a reference of how extreme the weather is. The plot that you have here in the upper part is just a graphical representation of the ISO curves in terms of the temperature conditions, whether they were on average, above, or much above average. And you can see that all of that is orange or dark red, signaling how extreme the heat wave event was. And because of that, that's naturally reflected in this high level of loads. Next slide, please. As I indicated, we continue to have a series of market enhancements that triggered from the summer 2020 event. Many of those became permanent provisions, and some of those are continuously in place. Some of those are triggered by a specific event, such as, for instance, we have to implement a specific condition once we are in EA2 or EA3. And there are others, such as the FERC Order 831, that is an enhancement that came from an order that allows us to increase the bid cap under certain conditions. When we put all these conditions together, we have a better market logic and functioning to allow us to handle this type of extraordinary events. And many of those were at play during this heat wave, such as the triggering of the bid cap to $2,000, the scheduling priorities, for instance, for load, exports, and wheeling. These are an extension of the provisions that we implemented for the previous summer. They are going to be in place until the next summer, while we work with all the entities and participants in finding a more sustainable long-term solution for the scheduling priorities. Next slide, please. And there are many ways you can illustrate the conditions of the heat wave event. And as you may see through the report, we were very focused on a very narrow period of September 5th through the 8th, even though the most critical period was September 6th. And in this illustration, what we have is a couple of references. The first one is the load profile. We have the actual load profile, that is the upper blue line trend, and the net load, because it's equally or even more critical to be able to manage the conditions during the net load, and that is with the dotted gray line that is below the gross load. And the red and the purple dots represent the actual peak for both of the trends. Now, there is a section there in yellow. That is the section under which we were for an EA2 or EA1. They happen to be for the same time frame. And then we have the watermelon orange section that is in the middle, that is representing the emergency stage 3. That is the most critical time when we start arming load. And it is important to see the time frame of the emergencies relative to the load trends, and where we were in the peak, in the gross or net. And there is a vertical line in dark red. That is the time when the emergency call came in, and there is a portion in there that is in green, that is part of the gross actual load. That is representing the time frame in which we have demand response in the system. So if you put all these pieces together, you can see how critical this time frame was and how conditions quickly developed. For instance, you can see all the reaction to the demand based on the demand response. You can see the sudden drop after we have the emergency call. You can see that the emergency stage 3 was capturing precisely the most critical period for operations, that is the net load peak that happens to be towards the end of hour ending 19. And that gives us some perspective of the dynamics and the conditions that we have in terms of the demand for that critical day of September 6th. As you may see through the report, there are different components that we try to estimate, and one of them obviously is the conservation. Out of all these conservation efforts from the flex alert, from the emergency call, how much demand reduction, how much conservation we have. It's not feasible with the information that we have to try to untangle each of the components. But altogether, we can see that after we have the call at 1748, all the conservation efforts amounted to about 1,500 megawatts of reduction of demand. And that is quite a meaningful amount of conservation that we saw that obviously play a role in being able to meet the supply and demand and provide the last megawatt of relief when we were in this emergency stage 3. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, before we move forward to a slightly different topic, let's see if we have any questions, Brenda, on the phone or through the chat.
We don't have any pending questions. We were able to answer the few questions we got on chat. But Marvin, can we confirm any questions in the audio line, please?
I currently don't see any audio questions queued up.
Okay, that's good. Let me move now into a slightly different topic. And if we go now into the consideration of the supply side, we have the resource adequacy capacity, and that is the capacity that we have the guarantee that is going to be available in the system. In addition to having the capacity on a monthly reference, that is the little upper right trend, you can see a flat line that is the shown array, and then the blue and orange shaded area represents the supply, the demand obligation that we have. That is the total demand forecasted plus the reserves obligation. And you can see during the heat wave and that these shaded area are above the shown array. As we progress into the operations of the market, the very first time to have a precise accounting of the supply that we have available in the system comes when we run the day-ahead market. That is the very first time when we can precisely estimate how much supply, potentially how many shortfalls we may have through the day, because that is the closer snapshot that we have in terms of the supply available. The lower part of the graphic is very specific to the period of September 5th through the 8th, and this has a few pieces of information. It has two trends. One is the supply, and one is the demand. The supply is composed by the areas in blue and green. The area in blue stands for the supply that is supported by resource adequacy. The area in green stands for the capacity that is either above array or non-array. And that gives you a perspective on an hourly basis for this critical period from the point of view of the day-ahead market, how much supply we have and how the composition of that supply was in the market. The other trend that we have is the trends for the load obligation. And there are different ways you can portray what the eventual load obligation is in our market. The simplest one is just taking the load forecast plus the operating reserves needs, and that forecast is just the natural produced forecast that we have in the system. That would be the first line, that is the lowest line in purple. Now, on top of that, we have another trend that is once we adjusted the load forecast in the day-ahead time frame, what we call the load forecast that is utilized in the reliability unit commitment, that factors in any incremental demand that operators are putting in there to handle the different uncertainties that we have in the system. That naturally is going to increase the load obligation because it's with an adder for those uncertainties. And that happens to be the next line that is in dark blue. Now, on top of that, we can go one step further and consider that the market still has to procure for those exports that are high priority exports, those that have come into the system with supporting resources that are non-RA. So that will give you overall the total load obligation that potentially the market needs to have available in terms of supply to be able to balance supply and demand. Ideally, when we compare, for instance, the standard load forecast or the adjusted load forecast against the supply, the expectation would be that the RA capacity should be able to cover all that obligation. If you compare these two together, the supply with the demand, you can see that mostly in the net load peak hours or in the downward ramp of the gross load, we can see that the load demand, the load obligation falls into the green area, meaning that we have to rely on capacity that is above RA or non-RA because it was not sufficient from the RA fleet to be able to meet that obligation. And this only captures the reference of the day-ahead market. And still, conditions change. Things happen from the day-ahead time frame to the real time frame. Next slide, please. There is a series of metrics that you also can find in the report when we try to move a bit closer to the actual operation of the system. The previous representation was from the perspective of the day-ahead market. Once we go into the actual operation of the system, we may have more than one reference point to assess how effectively the supply was available in the market, how well the performance of the fleet was in the market. And this metric is a little bit busy, but let me try to explain. We have, for instance, the first point that is represented with the dark red markers. That stands for the shown array for the month of September. And this is organized by supply type. Now, there are bars standing for what we call the resource adequacy capacity available in the system. The gray one stands for all the RA capacity. Then there is a section for blue bars that stands for any capacity supply that is above RA. And then there is a portion that is the lighter gray that stands for any capacity that is non-RA. So one reference of comparison would be taking the RA capacity, the shown array, that is the red marker, against the height of the cumulative bars. And the expectation is that if we have enough RA capacity, the dark gray is going to be about the same level of the shown array. And you can see, depending on the technology, the performance is different. For instance, let's go with gas, and that is on the right-hand side. For gas, we have about 29 or so megawatts of array shown. In the actual operation of the system, when we go into the real-time market, the 5-minute market, that is the last opportunity to balance the system to the market, we have about, I would say, about 25,000 megawatts of gas effectively contributing to meeting the demand at that point in time. There is a small portion of blue that is energy or supply that is coming from resources that carry RA, but they are above the RA shown level. And altogether would give you about maybe 26,000 megawatts. That is one reference, and obviously the delta between these total cumulative bars against the red marker is the performing of the capacity that was supported by RA but was not available, didn't show up in the market for whatever reason. And obviously the largest reason for that is the outages that are bounded to happen in the operation of the system. And you can elaborate on that for any other technology. Now, there are all other two markers in that graph. And these markers are regarding what we call the actuals. The bars stands for capacity bidding and available in the real-time market dispatch, the 5-minute market. A slightly different reality maybe when you actually see how much the resources actually produce. That is what we call actual. These two markers, the filling dot marker and the circle, stands for the total actual capacity in the system. That is based on actual telemetry that was measured at the operation of the peak time. And that gives you another reference. Why we do that? Because measuring the performance is quite tricky. If we look at, for instance, just on what the bidding capacity is, that is good in one sense because it's telling us how much capacity is made available to the system. If the resource is not performing to that level, that bidding capacity is not much of great relevance because the resource performs in a different way. And the metrics that we have also in the report are very specific to the peak times. It's just a snapshot of the peak time. Because, for instance, if you want to take something of a wider picture, let's say you want to see for the last 3 hours around the peak, how that performance was. Depending on what metric you use, you can be getting a very deceiving picture of the reality. For instance, if you are taking the bidding capacity that was made available in the market for a period of 3 hours around the peak, that is going to be off because it is not expected that all resources are going to be able to bid in or to be dispatched fully even before the peak time. If you take an extreme case, for instance, and you want to see the performance of the fleet, let's say in hour ending 15, and that is far away from the peak time, even if the bids are available, the dispatches of the market are going to be way below the total capacity of the array, simply because the resources are not fully loaded, because they are not needed yet. It's going to be only when you reach the peak time when you expect that the resources are going to be fully loaded and the market is going to be dispatching fully those resources. Taking dispatches prior to the peak is going to be a little bit deceiving because it's going to reflect not only the schedules awarded by the market based on the conditions that are not peaking conditions. And that is the reason we try to create these two perspectives of the bidding capacity in the 5-minute markets only for the peak time, and also the actual production. That is really what matters to balance the system in the actual operation of the system. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Changing topics. One of the drivers for the operation of the system obviously through the market, and the market is driven by the economics. And a big signal from the market is prices. Prices is a good reflection of the health of the market and the overall conditions. And there were several enhancements that we implemented since the summer 2021 to try to create better price signals to incentivize resources to signal the tight supply conditions in the market. Here you have the trend for the month in the upper corner and the specific trend across the markets for this critical period of the heat wave. And it's interval based, so it's a bit crowded in the lower plot, but that still gives you the trend of the prices. And you can see when we look at the whole month of the trend, prices naturally raised up to 2,000 during the heat wave. And prior to that, they were in different ranges. When we look at the specific period of September 5th to the 8th, we can see that prices reach the level of 2,000. Depending on the location, you may see prices actually going higher than 2,000. But if you look at the delapse, you can see that the prices were naturally up to the $2,000 mark. And that happens to be mainly because during the specific hours of this heat wave, we trigger the First Order 831 provisions. And that is when we take into account the prices from the external references and they reach certain level with some shaping that we do. And we have the conditions to raise the price cap from 1,000 to 2,000. That bid cap is going to be applicable to specific resources such as non-array inputs. It's not across all the fleet of the supply that we have in the system. That said, if there is a resource that is with a bit above 1,000, anywhere between the 1,000 and 2,000 range, they can set the price. And if they set the price, obviously the marginal clearing price is going to be set by that. And across the system, different resources are going to be able to see that higher clearing price as well. And the other factor is that when we are in these tight supply conditions, there may be cases in which the market is going to be power balancing feasible. If we are dealing with undersupply, that means we don't have enough supply to meet all the load obligations. We're going to be infeasible, and we are going to trigger this administrative price to signal the infeasibility. And that is now pegged to the bid cap of 2,000. So there are two ways how the clearing prices can reach this level of 2,000 because of a bid over 1,000 setting the price, or because of the infeasibility based on the bid cap of 2,000. And as you can see across the markets in the real time, we were able to reach those prices at different intervals of the day. Now, there has been some discussion in the past, this is not news to anybody, that there is some divergence between the markets. And we see divergence between the day ahead to the real time and within the real time, from the 15-minute market to the 5-minute market. And one of the factors that we have assessed in the past, and is not different to these events of September, has to do with the fact that prices in the 15-minute market were generally higher than prices in the real-time 5-minute market. Part of that has to do with the more stringent demand conditions that the 15-minute market has to meet. And in part of that was because of the load conformance applied to the 15-minute market. And I think we have a couple of metrics in the presentation to elaborate more on that. There was also, I remember, a couple of questions in different forums asking how can it be that during these tight conditions, potentially even still within the emergency condition, that the prices happen to be negative. We look at that, and we knew that there were some negative prices past the peak time, still within the range of the emergency time frame. And the interesting part that we have to realize is that looking at the system marginal energy component is good until you have congestion. If there is congestion, and that is the whole purpose of having a location and marginal price, the price that matters at the end is the full LMP. How you decompose that LMP into the energy component or the congestion component is a relative decomposition. And some questions were about specifically why the SMEC, the system marginal energy component, was negative. Well, that could signal that the CAISO was in oversupply, right? That is the first reaction. How can it be that you are in oversupply when you are in this emergency condition? Well, yeah, but we're looking only into the energy component. When we look into the full LMP, you can see that the full LMP was in the range of a few $100 positive. And that is because there was very heavy, very high congestion across the CAISO balancing area. So with that, you can start getting the sense that the price composition was simply reflecting a condition that we have in the system that was driven by congestion. When you look at the component, you can see that all the areas in the CAISO area were basically with very high positive congestion components. And we elaborate in the report that was because we have a specific constraint that is north of the balancing area of the CAISO. That is basically the COI, the COI constraint. And that basically puts all the generation on the CAISO side on one end of the constraint, and therefore is going to send one single price signal to the whole fleet of resources down the constraint. That is effectively the California resources. And in order to manage that congestion, we are signaling that we have to effectively decrease generation in the CAISO to manage the constraint. That is opposite to the expectation that you may have a high price during the tight supply conditions. But again, once you put all together with the congestion, that solution makes a lot of sense because the congestion is compensating for the total effect, and you end up with a high positive LMP. Before we move forward, let me see if there are any other questions at this point. Brenda?
We do have 3 questions in queue for chat. We can go ahead, and if our market analysis team could go ahead and review those, so we could go ahead and answer them. But let's go ahead and, do you want to go ahead and take the first question?
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, the first question was from Caroline Callahan from Emergency Management Services. And she asked if you can provide further explanation of higher FMM prices driven by load conformance.
Yeah, I think I just touched on that. I don't know if the question was coming before the explanation, but let me try to explain again. The conformance in the real-time market effectively means that we have added load obligation to the market. If we have a load of, I don't know, 50,000 megawatts, and we add a load conformance of 3,000 megawatts, effectively, we are asking the market to clear, to find supply to meet 53,000 megawatts of total demand requirement. And because of that, naturally, the market is going to go higher in the bid stack. That naturally is going to result in higher prices to clear that higher level of demand. That is one dynamic that happens on that market on its own. Now, when we go from the 15-minute market into the 5-minute market, the 5-minute market, the load conformance and logic is slightly different. The drivers, the motivation for that is different, and I will explain in the next slide. When we go into the real-time market, typically we are not going to see the same level of conformance that was in the 15-minute market. It's going to be typically, generally, something lower. Instead of 5,000 megawatts, it may be 1,000 megawatts. So that means that the real-time market interval dispatch now is trying to meet supply for a much lower demand level. And that simply means to be clearing the market at a lower point in the bid stack that naturally is going to land in a lower price. And that is how we have seen that the effect of the load conformance contributes to this price divergence between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market.
Thank you, Guillermo. Just to clarify, that was Carolyn from Energy Management Services. Great question. Second question from Mark Smith from Calpine. Why doesn't the substantial load conformance, what looks like 10,000 megawatts, affect RTD as much as FMM?
Yeah, I would like to hold that question and answer because I think the next slide is going to touch on the conformance. So I would like to revisit the question after that.
Great, no problem. We are ready to move on to the next slide.
Okay. I'm precisely talking about load conformance. And this is not a new topic. I think this has been a very key item of discussion that we have had in different forms, including the price formation, including the resource efficiency evaluation. And we understand this is a very sensitive item because it does have effects on the market clearing process and the health of the market. This illustration is a trend for the month on an hourly basis, on a daily profile. This illustrates the level of conformances across the different markets, starting with the reliability unit coordinate process that we call ROC adjustment. This is still a load conformance. Going through the HASP, the hourly ahead scheduling process, followed by the 15-minute market, the FMM, and lastly, the RTD interval dispatch, the 5-minute market. And the daily profile is useful to give you a sense of the nature of the conformance. We can see, for instance, that in the day ahead market, we have adjustments that reach 10,000 megawatts of demand, additional 10,000 megawatts of demand. And I believe that happened after the critical day. I think that should have been September 9 or 10. Then when we go into the HASP, the maximum level of conformance that we have is up to 5,000 megawatts. And the profile of the conformance between HASP and FMM is generally very, very close one to the other. They track very closely because given the timing of inputting the conformance into the market, it's a natural consequence of carry over the same conformance into the 15-minute market. This plot is a distribution of the levels of conformance through the month. So every box represents 1 hour, and the length, the size of the box with the whiskers stands for the distribution of the conformance levels. For instance, if we look at rock, the whisker endpoint is 10,000 megawatts. That means there was an outlier value of 10,000 megawatts for that hour ending 18 or 19. And the amount of samples that are contained in the box is about the 50 percentile, meaning it goes from the 25 percentile all the way to the 75 percentile. And there is a small dot somewhere inside the box that stands for the average of the conformance. So that gives you, on average, a reference of how much the conformance was. And that is the same organization for all the markets. Now, if we go into the actual profiles, we can see that obviously the rock was quite extreme, up to 10,000 megawatts. And in the report, we actually provide more analytics, and we actually provide the breakdown of how we arrived to this 10,000 megawatts. For the real-time market, we can see that there is quite a difference between the HASP and FMN against the RTD market. While HASP and FMN may have a conformance of up to 5,000 megawatts, the corresponding RTD didn't exceed the 2,500 megawatts, a half of that. And we have explained in different occasions what are the drivers for these conformances. I would say that we have to classify or organize these drivers. There are mainly 4 conditions for which the conformance is going to be in place. The first one, obviously, mostly for the real time, has to do with the flexible ramp. We know that we have some inefficiencies currently in the current construct of the flexible ramping product. The conformance is a way for operators to regain that flex capacity that is not provided naturally to the market. Because even though we may be clearing a certain amount of flexible ramping capacity, based on historical performance, we have seen that that capacity gets stranded, is not deliverable, and we have that inefficiency there that we are expecting to cure and to improve with the upcoming fall release on December 1st with the enhanced flexible ramping product that we have for the real-time market. As a reference now, this feature is going to be locational. We are going to be able to procure more locational, the flexible ramping product. So we are expecting that is going to alleviate the need for part of that load conformance. There is also the component naturally inherent to the operation of the system that has to do with uncertainty. We know that uncertainty exists for the load. We know that uncertainty exists for the wind, even in the real-time time frame. And we indeed analyzed a few days of the very early days of the heat wave, and uncertainty realized. And there is a factor in there that we have to be able to consider that operations is subject to this uncertainty, and therefore we have to hedge for that when it realizes. The other factor that we have to consider is that, for instance, in the day-ahead market, we have hourly granularity. We are moving on a profile on an hourly basis. Still, we have to deal with intra-hour ramp conditions, such as the solar, right? We know that the solar in 1 hour, let's say in hour ending 19, is going to observe a ramp decrease that is quite severe. That is the time when we are sunsetting, and therefore the ramps are quite dramatic, even intra-hour. So that is a factor to consider in there. And another factor that has to be internalized, and it's not explicit to the operators, they only see the effect, and that is the effect that they have to manage, has to do with the uncertainty related to the Western energy imbalance transfers. We clear HASP based on the interties available on the clearing of those transactions, but also taking into account the advisory transfers. And we have shown in the different analysis that these advisory HASP transfers, in some cases, don't realize in the real-time market. That is an uncertainty that the operators factor in when they see all these moving pieces together. And overall, these are mainly the 4 conditions for which the load conformance is going to be in place. And the consequence of having that load conformance naturally is going to rely in the real time mainly on the price divergence that I have explained. For the day-ahead market, that adjustment may result in committing additional resources for the CAISO. This is only mainly for the CAISO balancing area. I think there is one point that was very well discussed in an initiative that we just completed, and that is about the resource efficiency evaluation. There was this belief that we were explicitly using the load conformance to be able to pass the resource efficiency evaluation test. And we have shown, we have put analytics behind the logic and the dynamic, that the point is that the need for the load conformance is not driven for the operators to think to pass or not the resource efficiency test. That is not a factor in the consideration. It may be a natural consequence of being able to gain additional supply. For instance, when we have a load conformance applied to the HAS market, to the hourly ahead scheduling process, one consequence of having that conformance is that we're going to clear additional imports. This is a way to gain that additional intertie supply. This is not phantom supply. This is additional supply that is coming out through the HAS market that is going to be in the real-time market as long as they perform. And consequently, that supply is going to show up in the resource efficiency evaluation. But it's actual capacity that the CAISO has gained through the HAS market. That is the last opportunity to gain that additional supply. And it's not for the intent of passing the test, but rather to have that flexibility, that supply procured in the last opportunity that we have in the real-time time frame. With that, let me pause and see if we have any remaining questions about the load conformance.
Yes, Guillermo,
Okay.
we do have, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we have a verbal question here, and I can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Guillermo. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. First, just want to say thank you for the amount of detail that went into the report. And I know you were only able to draw out a small amount of it in this presentation, but the information that you and your team provided around the drivers for the day-ahead load conformance, splitting out between load uncertainty, solar movement, solar uncertainty, wind uncertainty. I think that's the first time that we've seen that data published, and it really helps start to kind of tell the whole story of what's going into the assessments that drive those RUC adjustments in the day ahead. One of the things that stood out to me in that section, though, was looking at the realized uncertainty from day ahead to real time, which, kind of taking as the what materialized in real time, broken out by driver between solar, wind, and load across those same hours relative to what was done in the day ahead RUC adjustments. And I don't expect that we have time to kind of dig into all of this here today, but I do really hope that we find time for that in the day ahead market enhancements discussion and in other initiatives in the price formation enhancements initiative as well, because it does stand out that the realized uncertainty for load primarily shows up in the midday hours, not during the peak hours, and that the uncertainty that realized during the peak hours was mostly driven by solar movement and solar uncertainty. And I think those are just important things to talk through when it comes to developing products and looking at future market enhancements. But mostly just wanted to call out appreciation for providing all of that data and kind of looking forward to getting into it in more depth further down the road.
Thank you, Dan. We appreciate that. And let me just add a comment on that, because I think we include that in the report. This is an evolving process, right? I think over the years we have tried to improve, be more scientific about the determination of the others. It's a hard reality to have to deal with uncertainty when it's even harder to to measure that ahead of time, right? We can always play Monday quarterback and see what happened after the fact, right? But the problem is that the decisions have to be made beforehand, and that is really where the complexity is. Now, based on this, we take this as a lesson learned, right? We know that we have the different components. Statistically, they may not be additive, and that is a reality. And when we start discussing the day-ahead market enhancements 2-3 years ago, one of the drivers was precisely this component of the uncertainty. And that is how we eventually converge to the utilization of imbalance reserve, because uncertainty exists between the day ahead towards the real time. Now, taking that approach, and even though we are still along the line at the point of the effort of the policy, based on what we have observed recently, and given the fact that we have already gained some experience on this quantification of the uncertainty for the day-ahead market enhancement, that is what we call the imbalance reserve, what we are currently exploring, and it's still a work in progress, is to start providing a reference to our operations team of what the uncertainty is going to be based on the imbalance reserve logic. We already have the calculation, we already have developed the task to estimate this imbalance reserve for the day-ahead market enhancements. What we want to do is start utilizing that as a reference estimate for our operations of guiding them better of what the ROC adjustments potentially could be. Right now, as you may recall, we have discussed in different forums that we, as part of the process that we have for the day-ahead market, we provide guidance of what the extreme case, the high confidence band for the load forecast is. We have provided reference of what the potential uncertainty for load for wind and solar is, and they have this individual component. Now, with the calculation of the imbalance reserve logic, we feel confident that we can put that in practice and start using that as a guidance for our operators to have a more scientific calculation of what the uncertainty may be for the day ahead time frame. We will communicate eventually when we are at that point, but we are moving in that direction to be a more scientifically based calculation of the guidance for the uncertainty to serve as a reference for our operators.
Thanks, Guillermo. That's really helpful. And also just wanted to call out from a couple slides ago that the extra information that's in the report around the performance of some of the different resource classes and specifically around the non-RA import schedules and how those perform during the very tight system conditions was really helpful, and again helps inform some of the policy discussions that are going on around both DANE and EDAM, and the ability to rely on different types of resources during these conditions. So let's keep moving, but again, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Just to wrap up the topic of the conformance, this is the specific profile that we have for load conformance across the markets for these critical days of September 5th through the 8th. And this just compares how closely they track one to another. And as I was explaining, as we go into the actual operation, the real time, the conformance driven in the real time is mostly to meet the imbalances that the operators see. The conformance applied to the HAST or to the day ahead process is mostly to position resources ahead of time. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Touching on the prices, as I indicated, there were specific hours in which we triggered the FERC Order 831 provisions, in which effectively the specific resources are able to bid up to the $2,000 mark. Here you have the profile for the day ahead in the lower part, the real-time profile in the upper part, and it's color-coded by type of resource. As you can see, the majority of bids that were able to utilize the extra room up to $2,000 in the day-ahead market was mainly composed from convergence supply. That is the light blue. We also have some resources that are related to the imports that are represented with the dark blue. And this is effectively one way to incentivize that supply to be able to come to our system, right? One of the concerns in the past was that, well, if we were bounding the prices to $1,000 and there was the tight supply conditions across the West, the CAISO area may be at disadvantage to attract the right supply because our prices were too low relative to somewhere else in the West. Part of that FERC Order 831 was to trigger these conditions when we see external prices reaching levels high enough to trigger these conditions. At that point, and through the report, you can see that we have different comparisons of the CAISO prices relative to external prices, and they were at the same level. In some cases, indeed, the prices at CAISO may have been even higher than the external prices, but it really goes to the core of making sure that the price signal for the CAISO area is there. And when we go into the real time, obviously the convergence bids are no longer there. The only resources that we saw bidding higher was related to the RDR, the reliability demand response, that by process, they are bidding up to 95% of the bid cap. Next slide, please. Changing topics. This is more about the resource efficiency evaluation. And similar to any other balancing area, CAISO area is subject to the resource efficiency evaluation. Specific to the analysis, we focus on the capacity test. And the lower part stands for the profiles of the demand, the load profile across both the actual demand, the net load demand, in comparison to the demand utilized when assessing the capacity test. And this comparison is useful because when we're running the capacity test, it's always looking ahead. And we are running 40 minutes in advance, conditions are going to change. When we start having this type of energy conservation efforts, the triggering of these efforts are going to result in a reduction of demand. So when you compare the actual demand that reflects all that conservation versus the demand utilized in the capacity test, you can see that there is a meaningful delta, precisely because now the actual demand is tracking lower. And there is a factor to consider. There is also the reference there of the emergency timeframes, the EE2 or EE3, and relative to the two intervals in which the CAISO area failed the test. And the failure is represented with these light green areas that are around ending 18 and 19. The consequence in the real-time market when we fail the test is that the specific area failing the test, in this case the CAISO, is going to be bounded from above to not be able to bring more transfers to what was in the last round. And that is the logic that we currently have. The graphic that you have in the upper part is reflecting the trend of the actual transfers that we have from the EIM market. The shaded areas in yellow and orange stand for the emergency period. And there are two dots somewhere contained in the orange area. These two dots are effectively the limits imposed on the transfers to the CAISO. And if you can see the one that is at the end of our ending 18, the limit was in the range of, 3,000 megawatts. While the natural transfer was a portion of that, it was way below. Naturally, the amount of transfers that were happening in the system for the CAISO area were way below the transfer limit that was imposed because of the failure. The second instance that is a little bit later in our ending 19, it seems to be along the line of the transfer. So naturally, we were ramping up. The limitation imposed by the failure was minor because you can see that we are already tracking below that. So in short, in summary, the fact that we have these two failures of the test have very little meaning or material impact to the influence of the transfers because the transfers were already naturally tracking below the levels of the limitations. Next slide, please. As you may see through the report, I don't go in great extent in this presentation, but in the report, we explained that there were about 8 or so reasons that resulted in miscalculation of the capacity in the capacity test. These miscalculations were in either direction, overcounting, undercounting, depending on the specific nature of the issue. We have issues impacting the calculation for MSG, multi-stage generating resources. We have issues in the counting of the AS, effective regulation, spinning, non-spin, for the capacity test. We have undercounting, overcounting when it comes to the imports and exports cleared in the HASP market, given the logic that we have about reductions of exports or imports in the market. And that has to do with some logic that takes the reference of the market solution and use that to pass it into the capacity test. There was a breakdown in that communication of information, and therefore the test didn't have the right reference of those reductions into the assessment of the capacity. There are other items that are not issues per se, and not defects or something that got broken, but it's just the nature of how the logic has worked for the accounting of the capacity. Some of those has to do, for instance, with the counting of DC losses. We have some DC links in the system, and there is a type of process in place to account for the losses that incur in those links. And we do some type of in-kind accounting of those losses. Those losses are known until the flow is happening. So we cannot project precisely what the losses are going to be in the day-ahead market or in the HASP market. And therefore, they show up until the 15-minute market or the 5-minute market. And that creates a divergence between these two. And therefore, when we go into the calculation of that capacity into the test, we may create a divergence between the real-time operation and the capacity test. There is also some accounting that we track for the condition of arming load. Once we are in an emergency condition, one of the last steps that we rely on is arming load. That means we get load ready to be dropped in a matter of 10 minutes. And by the time we are able to arm that load, consequently, we can release the contingency reserves into the energy stack. Now the contingency capacity is converted or deployed into energy to meet our demand obligation. Depending on that timing, that capacity naturally is not considered in the test because it's happening basically just on real time. And once we do all these plus and minuses of the capacity test, we did some type of counterfactual. Adding these plus and minuses, we effectively recalculate the capacity test. And what we ended up getting is that if all these issues were properly accounted for in the capacity test, the CAISO should have failed 4 more additional intervals in that critical period of September 6th. And they are represented with the green dots in the upper part of the plot. The purple dots below are the 2 actual intervals that we originally failed in the September 6th time frame. That would have been the material consequence of having these issues not impacting the capacity test calculation. Now, if you have the reference of the previous slide, you can see that for this specific period of September 6th, the limitations that would have been imposed on the CAISO transfers would have been basically at the same level of the first one, that is about 3,000 megawatts. Naturally, the transfers were already way below that range. So the implication of this is that even though the failures didn't happen for the CAISO area because of these issues in the calculation, the consequence was immaterial because anyway, the transfer limits wouldn't be binding because the transfers already materialized in the system were way below the limitation. So there was no material consequence for not having counted properly these failures in the test. Next slide, please. Changing topics, but along the line of transactions among balancing areas. One of the components that play a role in being able to navigate the critical conditions of September 6th has to do with the level of imports that we have in the system. And this representation is what we call the net schedule interchange. That is the net balance of all imports, static or dynamic, with the exports. Is the total additional supply that is coming into the CAISO balancing area. This has two trends. One is for the net schedule interchange that is effectively based on the intertie transactions, imports, dynamics, and exports. And the other component adds the contribution of the Western energy balance transfers, because at the end of the day, these are additional supply coming into the system as import transfers. So the total net schedule interchange that the CAISO had during this critical period is effectively the light blue. And as you can see, for the critical period of September 6th, about our ending 19, it was about 7,000 megawatts that we have to rely on to meet our load obligation. Next slide, please. This is the composition. It's always interesting to see where that transfer is coming from. For September 6th, it was about 1,000 megawatts of transfers coming into the CAISO from different areas. And this color code tells you not the source of the transfers, but where they are coming from, because that is the only piece of information we can illustrate. There may be will-through transactions coming from faraway entity areas, passing through different areas, but we can only track the last area where that transfer is coming from, not necessarily the sourcing area where the transfers are originated. And you can see, I think the picture here is going to illustrate that the transfers are quite dynamic. These are moving on 5-minute basis, and obviously the conditions as they change dynamically in the market is going to induce patterns in the transfers that are reflective of the overall economics of the system. And as we go deeper into the critical hour of September 6th, we start to see less and less transfers coming into the CAISO system. Next slide, please. If we want to compare just the snapshots of the peak time, on one end you have the actual gross peak on the left versus the net load peak on the right. And this just gives you a sense of how the change of the transfers happened in the CAISO area. There was indeed one area that flipped directions, rather than being an import, became an export. All the other ones is a reduction of transfers, naturally, because we have tighter situation in the net peak. But it still shows the effectiveness of the Western energy balance market to rely on many different areas, and the market be able to find out that last megawatt across the whole footprint to maximize the transactions across the different areas. Next slide, please. Keep going with the intertie discussion. We have provided many different facets of the intertie transactions for this critical period. There are many different ways to organize the transactions, and each one has its own merit. One way to organize these transactions of interties coming into the system has to do with the nature of the transactions, whether they are non-resource specific import transactions or whether they are dynamic transactions, whether they are imports or exports. And also, very important to realize that when we talk about interties, we also have to keep in mind that interties are utilized to build these will-through transactions. The will-through transactions are going to have an import and export component, and they are going to be seen as explicit imports and exports. The criticality in this composition is to understand that those imports or exports that are associated with will-through transactions do not add or subtract supply or demand to the system. They are passed through, but they don't alter the power balance of the CAISO area. When you put all these pieces together, at the end of the day, the dark trend with the line stands for the net scale interchange. That is how much, in the end, we have for intertie transactions. That is somehow similar to the previous slide where we track the net scale interchange. Next slide, please. When we were dealing with the tight supply conditions in the market on these days, one of the mechanisms that the market uses to balance supply and demand is either power balance supply infeasibilities, relaxing the constraint, the power balance, but also reducing the provisions of exports. That happens in each of the markets, in the ROC market, in the HASP markets, and they happen at different levels. This is just the trend of the reductions projected in the ROC process. And as you can see, in September 6th, they exceeded the 1,500 megawatts. That means, based on the conditions that we have for these days in the day-ahead market, the market required to reduce or not be able to clear up to 1,500 megawatts of exports. The majority of those have to do with the low priority. These are low priority exports that do not have supporting resources that are non-RA. These are just price takers coming into the market, willing to pay any price for the sake of being able to clear in the day-ahead time frame. If they are reducing the ROC process, these reductions are going to be used as a reference of how much can be self-scaled into the real time. They still have the opportunity to participate economically or with self-scales brand new in the real-time market. Now, when we go into the real-time market, the same exercise is taking place. The HASP market is going to assess all the conditions, all the supply available to determine what level of exports can clear or have to be reduced if they are self-schedules. Next slide, please. This is the same picture, but in the time frame of the HASP real-time process. And this is a very complicated graph to explain because we have issues in the clearing process, and we have explained that in the report. You can see here that there are reductions of exports associated with different types of exports. Real-time low priority, day-ahead low priority, and interesting enough, ETCs and TORs. There are not a single high priority exports shown here. The original market solution indeed projected to reduce these high priority exports by process before the solution goes out downstreams. These reductions are blocked because they are high priority. They are expected to flow unless we are in this condition where we have to reduce our own load. So that is a manual step that the operators would have to take once we're in this emergency condition of dropping load. Because they were originally projected to be curtailed and they were blocked before going out, we don't put them here because they didn't realize it. Now, the ones that went out and eventually some of those have to be reinstated are shown here. The ones that are low priority, they were reduced, they didn't flow as expected. The ones that are in blue that are related to ETCs and TORs, originally they were reduced in the market, in the HASP process. They were not blocked as part of the process, but because they were high, they were associated with this super high priority of ETCs, TORs, eventually they were reinstated or they actually flow in the actual operation of the system. And that is the reason we were trying to put the transparency here of indicating how much these exports were projected to be reduced. This is not the intended outcome. This is not exactly how the market should have worked. We have addressed this issue with an enhancement in our market, and the solution is now clean. Ideally, what should have happened is that we should have reduced all the low priority exports completely. On the original solution, we actually cleared up to 1,000 megawatts of those low priority exports. Likewise, we should have not reduced any ETCs, TORs, because they were high priority. This is one of the outcomes that we saw because of this unintended logic that even though we have the right scheduling priorities in the market, by the time there is another logic in the market that conflicts with this working logic, we end up with this unintended results that the priorities were not respected. Not because we didn't have the priorities in place, but because it conflicts with another piece of the logic. That other piece of the logic is what we call the pricing consistency enhancements that we implemented back in 2016. When we go and put out a solution from the market, in the real time, is based on the solution from the price and run instead of the schedule and run. The complication is that in the price and run, we no longer have the sequencing of the different priorities because everything is based at the bid cap because we are trying to discover an economically meaningful price. The priorities act and play a role in the schedule and run when we have all these different prices. But because we are using now the solution from the price and run, now that priority is gone. Everything is set at the bid cap, and therefore you may end up with this type of consequences. The problem is deeper than this because ideally when we move from the schedule and run into the price and run, the solution megawatt schedule-wise in the price and run should be very close to the original solution of the schedule and run. And that is the piece where we have enhanced the logic to ensure that we achieve very close solution in the price and run to what the schedule and run is telling us, so that these reductions indeed don't realize in the wrong sequencing in the price and run. I know this is a little bit complicated. Let me take questions to see if we have any questions so far.
Okay, and we do actually have a couple of folks in the verbal queue. I'll go ahead and unmute the first.
Hey, Guillermo, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions again. Sorry to take you back a ways, but back to your the last resource efficiency evaluation slide. Lost track of which one that is now. I think it is, let's say, slide 16.
One more. This one or the next one?
That one.
Yeah.
I guess that's 18 in yours. So around the counting of emergency energy. So I popped a link into the chat box here. Back on November 8th, when the DMN did their kind of initial report to the Regional Issues Forum around this kind of same time period, they had a slide in there, slide 12, that looked at additional real-time imports that the CAISO got through out-of-market and emergency energy purchases. And that was really the first time that I think I've seen a report showing the volume of those out-of-market purchases, which I'm presuming are generally on the interties. And so that I just, here or further down the road, I think it'd be good to discuss, should these out-of-market purchases be included in the resource efficiency counting for CAISO? Do they count as supply? When are they being made? How reliable are they? Are they being realized? And then sort of on the flip side of that is, what implications do they have or should they have for price formation? Should that be a discussion as well? I think it'd be interesting to look at these volumes when the purchases were made, those sorts of things, and compare it against that metric that you had in the report that was looking at uncleared but offered non-RA intertie offers, and kind of line up, what was done in market, what was done out of market, what the pricing was doing, those sorts of things. So I'm just hoping that the CAISO could pick that up as a reporting metric in the future. Happy to see DMM do it, but, I think it would fit well in your reports as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Let me just comment on that because I think the most critical piece of information that may have an impact on the treatment of this emergency energy has to do with the timing. And what we saw when assessing this consequence in the resource efficiency evaluation really boiled down to the timing. It was a hit and miss that some emergency imports or exports make it into the test and some others didn't. So it was not by design, but because of the timing. So if it was known well in advance to the timing of running the sufficiency test, they may have been considered. And I think there is a more important question here. Forget about the current logic of whether it was a timing or not. Policy-wise, should we include emergency energy or not into the calculation of the resource efficiency evaluation? The emergency conditions that we have on that day resulted not only on imports into the CAISO area to come, but we also provided emergency to other areas. So it's a two-way pathway. We have imports and exports regarding intertie emergencies. And at the end of the day, it's an accounting mechanism, right? Net-wise, what was the net position? Because we have both. It's not just one single direction. But you raise a good point, and I think that should be something that we have to explicitly discuss what the design should be, how we should account for the emergency energy in the context of the test.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And acknowledging kind of operating on imperfect information here was just kind of what was in that slide. But I had assumed that the emergency assistance was sort of operator to operator coordination. Some of the things that Elliot talked about, and Mark, thanked the region for the efforts that went into that. Of course, knowing the timing on that would be good, but I think at least from the DMM slide, the out-of-market purchases look to be much more substantial than the emergency assistance volumes on those days. And so kind of knowing the timing and whether those are done, post-HASP, but pre-binding RSE, might indicate how they should be looked at. Just one other thing I wanted to call out before dropping off here, so I know you'll get to it at the end. There was a metric in there too about energy offset costs, real-time energy offset costs, and real-time congestion offset costs, and just noting how much higher those were during this September heat wave event, and kind of mapping back to the June, July outcomes for those metrics as well. I think that's another area that would be nice to pick up some more conversation around and see what is really driving here in 2022 this steep increase in those offset costs between the day ahead and real-time market, and if there's anything that can be done about that in the existing market, or if that's something that the CAISO expects changes like EDAM to help by getting better alignment between the day ahead and real-time models.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we do have a chat question here as well from Caroline Karine. Were the BANC exports supported by resources? Slide 18, offline response is fine if you don't want to go into that.
And sorry, I couldn't follow what the question was.
Were the BANC exports supported by resources?
Yeah, let me follow up offline. I just couldn't follow the question.
Okay. We do have another verbal question here as well. I'll go ahead and unmute that person.
This is Robert Fisher with NVE. I have a question in regards to the scheduling the pricing run enhancement that was put in later after the heat wave timeframe. Are you going to release the details of what that enhancement was and how help to resolve the issue?
Yeah, I think the next MPPF we can elaborate on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I believe that's all of the. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, let's move on to the next topic then. Next slide. Well, I think a few more. One more. Keep going, please. I think we were way ahead of that. Yeah, one before. Yeah, there is another area. I think we have been persistently tracking on this. Sorry, one before. Yeah, this one. Thank you. And this has to do with the array imports, and we have been very tailored on how we track this. This is only for a subset of records. This is only for those that are CPUC jurisdictional. These are for non-resource specific, basically the static imports, and only for the periods of time that belongs to weekdays for the assessment hours. And we have been doing that for all the months of the report. And what we show here, what we want to track is how well those array imports are coming into the market. There is an expectation that they are going to come at 0 or below 0 prices, or they could self-schedule. And for this month of September, overall, you can see that that was working very well. There may have been just a couple of megawatts here and there that didn't follow that, but over 99% of the volume of these array imports bid at 0 or below 0 or with self-scales. The blue portion here indeed shows that they were bidding as self-schedules. Now, if you go a little bit deeper, we also put a reference here. In addition to the bidding capacity, that is the expectation, we also track the array level, but also the awards, how much they were awarded or cleared in the market. And this is complicated, and I want to create the right expectation here. If we look at, for instance, for the month of September in the real-time market, you can see that the clear amount around September 7 was way below the bidding capacity. So we have about 3,300 megawatts of bidding capacity. The HASP market cleared only 2,700 megawatts. That is the value that went down in the first part of the month. We have been looking deeper into why that happened. And this is part of one of the challenges we have with one of the logics in the market. The original market solution, the HASP solution, was projecting to have to reduce these array imports, not because of a limited capacity on the intertie. There was no change on the intertie capacity for NOP. This is specific to NOP. The limit on NOP was exactly the same before and after. What happened is that on these hours that resulted in this reduction of the array imports, we have very heavy congestion in the northern part of the system for which these transactions were effective. So congestion-wise, we were reducing those array imports to manage the congestion. This is what this picture is showing. And I want to be very emphatic about that because there could be a potential understanding that these imports were reduced because they were crowded out by, let's say, wheel transactions or something else. That was not the case. Indeed, even though the reduction was, I don't know, about 600 megawatts, the wheel-through transactions that we have on that path, on that hour, was like 50 megawatts. So it was not because the wheel-through transactions were outcrowding the array imports. It was driven by congestion. Now, here is the most complicated part. That was the original HASP solution. There was a glitch in the processing of these records that eventually these reductions didn't realize in the actual system. These imports indeed flow into the system. They were honored at the original self-scheduled value. I don't know if there will be valid to revise this metric to reflect what actually happened, This is only showing what the original market solution was intending to do, but eventually the flows, those RA imports were able to flow into the system. They were not reduced. Next slide, please. Changing topics. One of the areas that attracted a lot of attention was the operation of the storage resources. They have a very good performance on September 5th. However, there was some interesting performance on September 6th. And the criticality here was that they start to discharge early in the day, starting as early as hour ending 13. And eventually, a couple of hours later, they have to reduce, either reduce discharge or actually start charging, because we were depleting prematurely those resources prior to the peak time. And in order to have enough state of charge for the most critical time of the day, the peak hours, they have to take this deep in the preceding hours. The concern was, how can it be that the market was not able to do a better job in dispatching these storage resources? And there are different moving pieces. One of those has to do with the item that I indicated earlier. We have a software issue that prevented some resources to charge early in the day to have enough state of charge for later in the day. That issue is addressed. Now, the other piece is that we have more logic about dispatching storage resources. One of those is that once we have projected infeasibilities in the rock market, we activate this minimum state of charge constraint in the real-time market. That is no more than ensuring that the state of charge is not going to go lower to the projected state of charge from the day-ahead market. And that is the trend that you have in the lower part of the plot. You can see that there is one for the rock that is stepwise, and one that is more smooth with the blue line, that is the real-time state of charge. And you can see that at the time when we effectively have these two lines converging, they are basically coming together in our ending 16 or so. That is the time when the discharge level of the storage resources took a dive, because it went down, precisely because we were hitting that constraint that we cannot continue to discharge, otherwise we go below the minimum state of charge. That was part of the logic to ensure that we preserve enough state of charge. I think the most basic question is why resources started to discharge that early in the day, in the preceding hours. And it is economics. We have checked that resources were in merit. That means the bidding price that were available for that time frame were low enough relative to the clearing prices such that they were in merit. They were economic, and therefore the market started to discharge those resources. And keep in mind, storage resources are use-limited resources. They have a limited amount of energy, and it's very critical how we can manage that state of charge. And as long as the prices are in merit, the market is going to take the action to dispatch them accordingly. And there may be some further discussions as to how we can better position the system if the prices are already in merit, whether the bids should have been reflecting a higher opportunity cost to not discharge them that early. Prices around that time were already in the range of a few $100s, and therefore they are going to be in merit. So there are still areas to explore what else we can do to better dispatch those resources. Part of the actions that we have to take in order to prevent further depletion of that state of charge is that some resources were manually dispatched to ensure that they preserve or they hold that state of charge for later in the day. In the report, you can see some metrics that we provided in terms of the volume, the number of resources that were manually dispatched to preserve or to hold that state of charge. The other question that may be related when you compare the dispatch of the storage resources with the negative prices, as long as you're looking at the full MP, as I discussed earlier, the prices were negative only for the energy component. The full NMP was still positive, and resulted in resources to be in merit for these hours of the day. Next slide, please. And the other moving piece when we talk about the storage resources has to do that they provide capacity not only to meet energy needs, but they also carry a large share of the regulation market. And therefore, they provide capacity that we have to rely on to be on regulation. And for those days, you can see that it was a meaningful amount of regulation capacity that they provided to the system. So it was overall was a good outcome to have that capacity available. Next slide, please. The last one. We have been tracking this, and in the report you have not only the wholesale cost, but also, as Dan indicated, we have metrics regarding the energy offset, the congestion offset, and granted, we have higher levels of demand, we have correspondingly high prices in the system. The natural consequence of these two higher values is going to be higher cost. And we have overall, I would say on average for a typical month, we have seen wholesale cost to be in the range of $55, $60 million per day. For the month of September, that average cost was about $110 million. And if you look specifically for the critical period of the heat wave, September 6th, that daily cost increased to $375 million. That is the wholesale cost. I understand there are other mechanisms by the participants to hedge this cost on a day-to-day basis. But it's important and interesting to see the implications of having these higher loads settled at higher prices. And overall, this is the trend of this wholesale cost for the month of September. And I believe this is the last slide. Can we check if we have one more? Okay, yeah. I think that's all what we have. We have still about 10 minutes to entertain any questions that we may have. So let's open the line to see for any questions.
Okay. Yes, Guillermo. So we do have two questions in our written chat. I'll go ahead and read those to you. Carly Page from MVPUC asked, so the high priority exports were manually adjusted such that they flowed, were not curtailed. The HASP solution would have otherwise generated a different solution without intervention.
Sorry, could you read again? I need to grasp it properly.
Yes. High priority exports were manually adjusted such that they flowed, were not curtailed. The HASP solution would have otherwise generated a different solution without intervention.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, let me elaborate on that. The original solution that we have was not optimal because of this complication that I explained about the scheduling run versus the pricing run interplaying with the priorities. The outcome of the market was to clear low priority exports that shouldn't have cleared, to reduce high priority and ETC STORs that shouldn't have been reduced. After the fact, we tried to cure that. Effectively, we reinstated the reductions of the high priority wheels. We reinstated the ETC STORs were able to flow. The original awards of the low priority exports still flow. We didn't curtail that after the fact. And that is how actually materialized. Once we have this issue addressed in the market logic, what should have happened is the following. We should have reduced, generally speaking, all the low priority exports. And I need to caveat that. Potentially, we may have to reduce some level of high priority exports that is subject to assessment by the operators once they are in the actual operation of the system. Now, if everything worked optimally, I wouldn't say that all the low priority exports should have been curtailed to zero, because there are caveats that we have to realize. One of them is that there may be some exports that are flowing on some constraints, on some interties that provide counterflow to imports. So if we reduce these exports, now we're going to have less imports to clear coming into the system. So this is a very simple case that we have to realize that it's more complicated than just reduce all the low priority exports. We have to be mindful that there are scenarios where these exports, even though they are low priority, they are clear because of other conditions, such as providing counterflows. And this is one of the complications that, in the end, the market has all the information, all the means to be able to optimally determine what is the best solution. So my takeaway on this is going to be that once we have addressed this issue, there may be still cases in which clearing some low priority exports is the right optimal solution to have. Let me see if there is any follow-up on that.
He said thank you.
Okay. Do I see one hand raised from Mike? Can we open the line for him, please?
Yes.
Hey, good morning, Guillermo. Yeah, this is all fascinating, and I've got actually a couple of questions, some unrelated, but just in general, going back to the load bias, what we saw were, significant bias in the FMM that resulted in high prices, and then significantly lower, or sometimes negative prices in the 5-minute market. Has the ISO done any sort of counterfactual analysis to see what the impact of those load bias was on the overall RTIEO costs allocation to load during those periods?
Yes,
because I'm assuming that increases the overall RTIEO cost to participants when that happens.
Yes, I think effectively the load bias could be seen as buying high, selling low, because you clear higher prices in FMM and you settle on that, and now you have to unwind that in RTD at lower prices. Yes, there could be an implication of the RTEO, the real-time energy offset. Now, regarding your first question, if we have done any analysis of the consequences of that load bias. We have, not specific for the September 6th, but we have done extensive analysis of the consequences of having load conformance in the HASP FMM market as part of the resource efficiency evaluation analysis that we provided to support the discussion of the policy initiative on the resource efficiency evaluation. And I would encourage people listening to this call to also check that analysis. We put a report out there where we elaborate specifically in a counterfactual basis what would have been the consequences if that conformance was not in place. And I can summarize that very shortly. Obviously, prices got down. The implications megawatt-wise is that we clear less imports, we reduce less exports, we clear less transfers, and we commit less internal resources.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, I'll go back and reference that document. Yeah. And generally, so going to the MSOC, when the MSOC is triggered, is there any consideration of looking forward in the day to real-time only charging bids that are submitted by storage resources? Because what we saw was, I think, sort of a jumping the gun, of implementing the MSOC prior to market bids that would have cleared and would have effectively done the same thing as the MSOC did especially a little bit earlier in the day.
Yeah. Can we go back one or two slides, please? And maybe this could be helpful. One more. Yeah, this one. Yeah. Here could be the complication, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't explore this. I think everything is open for discussion now that we have learned the operations of a storage under these extreme conditions. one of my reactions would be that even if we impose this minimum SOC in earlier hours, that could have been the case. You can see, if you compare, for instance, the peak hour of the SOC for September 6th in the lower plot, you can see that the minimum SOC is already way below the maximum SOC, the SOC of the real time. So having a constraint enforced that is already way below where you are, it may not bind at all. It may not drive to any solution. It may require that you impose a constraint that is more than what was projected in the day ahead, because you can see from there the step size, the black trend in the lower plot, is already way below that trend of the real time. So effectively enforcing that constraint early in the day wouldn't make much of a difference because you are already meeting that constraint.
Okay. All right. I think that helps. And then just one other question. I don't know that I've seen it addressed anywhere in the documentation, but what we observed, and this is just speaking from a fairly limited view of a large combined cycle plant that was providing regulation during the peak hours of the heat wave. And what we observed was that generally the AGC dispatch was moving in the opposite direction of the what would be seen as the intended market need given the pricing. So has there been any evaluation of the AGC dispatch impact on the overall effectively increasing demand by decking regulation resources to deal with ACE and effectively increasing your demand on the system?
Well, I will have to defer that item. I don't think I have any information to elaborate on that. We have been checking closely the performance of resources to follow the AGC, but I think your question is more about the overall system conditions that led to a down set point for those resources, and we will have to check to see what happened. Obviously, the balancing on the AGC is very, very fine, right? It's on a 4-second basis, and at any time you may have to deck resources just because you're instantaneous balancing condition. And that is not naturally capturing the 5-minute or the 15-minute market. That is what the granularity of our markets is. So there is an extra layer of complexity in the dynamics when you have to balance in 4-second basis. So we will have to check on that to see if we can elaborate on that more.
Okay, and I think there's discussions with the ISO separately, but and so you'll have all the information that you need to do that analysis. But yeah, we just thought it was interesting that was happening. Yeah. And again, it begs the question of evaluating, especially now with a higher. This was a combined cycle gas plant, but generally with storage providing a higher and higher percentage of the AGC requirement, providing some sort of guardrails on costs for breakdown, mainly breakdown, obviously, because in the situation that happened during the peak, if you were a storage facility providing breakdown, you could have very easily been put in some serious financial harm.
Yeah,
so it's something to consider.
Yeah, and we will take a look. I understand the dynamic that you are explaining here. Thank you.
Okay, that's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. We appreciate your thorough analysis and presentation you provided today. I'm going to go ahead and have closing remarks from Anna McKenna for our last slide right here. Thank you, Guillermo.
Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Brenda, and thank you, Guillermo. I wanted to start my closing remarks by thanking Guillermo and the entire CAISO team for such a great set of analysis. The report itself is quite extensive, and I know there's a lot of information in there. And I hope that today's discussion and our continued discussions about what how the markets and our operations performed during these stress conditions are helpful to all of you as well. These stress conditions do provide us a wonderful opportunity. I should say maybe unfortunate in many ways, but it does give us an opportunity to really understand how our markets perform and how our operations perform, and gives us a chance to also prepare for future events. And we do remain committed at the ISO to continue to improve our systems, our operations, our markets, our processes to be well prepared for similar events in the future. And I really do hope that today's discussion was beneficial to all of you, and we look forward to continued dialogue on these issues, because as we discuss this stuff, we learn ourselves. And with the last conversation bit that was had, we will continue talking about the performance of storage resources and what we can do better in all our market areas. So thank you all for participating today, and thank you again to Guillermo and team for a wonderful and very extensive and well-informed analysis of the summer events.
Brenda, we're currently not able to hear you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and close our call. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.